Hey everyone, this is Oscar from Underdog, and today's video is a bit of a technical one. It's about the mixdown, it's about all that audio engineering stuff. So if that's not something that you're interested in, this might not be the video for you. This one I'm going to get into some technical territory. But the thing that I'd like to share with you today is a reflection on something called dominant resonances, but specifically dominant resonances in the bass area, in the bass frequencies. First, let me explain what a dominant resonance is, and then let me show you why that's relevant in the bass. But first, a dominant resonance is a frequency anywhere in the frequency spectrum, not necessarily in the bass. Anywhere in the frequency spectrum, a frequency might pop out or be a little bit too loud compared to all the frequencies around it. One thing that you'll notice with a dominant resonance is that if you're listening to a sound and you want to turn up the sound on your speaker, at some point it's going to become uncomfortable, and the frequency that jumps out as being uncomfortable the soonest is probably a dominant resonance. So something that you might want to do in your mixdown overall is identify some dominant resonances and not notch them out completely, but just pull them down slightly so that they sit more in harmony with the other frequencies, so that the overall signal can be turned up, or at least that it doesn't rely so much on that one particular frequency. This is in some way similar to my hi-hat processing video that I did a few years ago, which is about notching out resonant frequencies in a hi-hat. It's kind of the same idea. And I'd like to give some credit to Connor Dalton, the mixing and mastering engineer, who made a huge PDF freely available of his mixing and mastering concepts. And in there is a concept of dominant resonances. And while I'm sure he didn't invent the wheel, it's definitely thanks to him that I'm consciously labeling the term as dominant resonances. Dominant resonances, get it into your mind. Now, the example of dominant resonances that I want to give you today is in the bass frequency. Specifically, when you have long, big sine waves in your bass, it can feel warm and quite innocent in your studio because your overall mixdown just sounds warm. But one thing that happened to me recently when I was working on this Indian vinyl song from a week or two ago was that it sounded great in my studio, and then I went for a long drive, and on that drive I played the song, and whenever the bass notes, the 808 in the bass hit, it would just go boom, and the whole car would kind of shake, and the rest of the mixdown would be barely audible just because that 808 was using up all the energy of the sound system. It would just all be going into reproducing that one deep note at like 50 hertz or something. Let me actually show it to you in Ableton. I think that'll be clearer. Okay, so this is the 808 that I'm talking about, okay? I'm going to play it to you in context now as well. So the origin of this sound is a MIDI note that goes into an Analog Lab 5. It's got a Moog preset playing just a deep 808, and that's sidechained to the kick. That's already one way in which I'm sort of managing the bass energy, is that it's sidechained to the kick. See, whenever the kick hits, the bass ducks a bit. That's awesome. Now, this channel goes into my drum group overall, so the sub bass, that 808 bass, in with the drum group, because I want them all to be processed together. Okay? And so in there, we've got a bunch of processing, a bunch of processing, a bunch of processing. And then at the end of it, there's also a multi-band compressor, which just manages the low energy of this drum loop. This is kind of like doing the cloakroom check, if you remember from one of my previous videos, doing the cloakroom check where you're only listening to what is going on in the lowest low frequencies. Now, these are the frequencies where if there are dominant resonances, they're going to swallow up all the energy of the low end, and they're going to put a lot of pressure on the rest of your mix. So this drum group then goes into the master, and in the master there's a bunch more processing. There's more saturation, there's an equalizer that just pulls down the low end overall, there's another multi-band compressor that swallows up the low end, and then at the end there's my limiters. Actually, I've done 2 limiters in a row. Okay, cool. But what I wanted to talk about specifically is this Pro Q3. This specific equalizer is the one that I put on there after my drive to France. I was in France. I live in Belgium. I was driving to France. Irrelevant details. I was going from Belgium to France, and every time that I played that bass note, it would pop out. And let me play it to you then without this Pro Q. So this is the mix that I played in the car. And every time that boom would happen, the rest of the mix just became blurry and obscured. So what I did was I put on this EQ, and it's what's it called? That's called a dynamic EQ. So it's an EQ that only kind of works when there's energy at that frequency. This is specifically to tame that one dominant resonance in the Moog bass. So it would totally have been legitimate to put it directly on the instruments. It would have been totally legitimate to put it directly on the drum bus. But in this case, I put it directly on the master. The reason for this was that I liked the overall mixdown. I just felt that that was one problem that was holding back the entire mix. But if I change that on just the element, maybe the relationships of the kick and the bass might change. And I just didn't want to go into those kind of questions. I just wanted to do the equivalent of what a mastering move would be. So on the master, I found the exact frequency that was the resonant frequency. And whenever it plays, it just dips -3 decibels. There we go. And how do you find the exact frequency? Well, I knew that it was going to be the lowest frequency of that 808, but let me show you a process that could work. So if I put on a fresh Pro Q3, I could make myself a little bell curve, make it relatively narrow, not super narrow, but like relatively narrow, and just solo. Okay. And then find the place where the energy feels like it explodes when it hits. It's going to be about here. A good hint on where to start could be to go to the Moog bass and to put on a spectrum analyzer, because it's definitely this is the culprit. So you see this particular frequency here, this is the offending frequency, and it plays 2 different notes. I'll address that in a moment. But specifically right now I'm addressing this frequency right here, which is the F. Is it F? Is it F sharp? I can't quite remember what key the track is in, but it's one of these 2 notes. And so all you got to do is go directly into your equalizer and notch down that particular sound. Now, there are 2 notes playing here, right? A low note and a high note. And while I was in the car, both of them kind of felt problematic, but I thought somehow that the low note was more problematic than the high note. So I notched out only the low note. Now, interestingly, as I replayed it back in the car, driving back from Berlin, because I drove from France to Berlin and Berlin to France. Don't ask me why. Oscar's mystery trip. Whenever that lowest bass note would hit, I felt the low end was perfectly balanced. It was warm, there was enough low energy, but I could still hear the mids and the high frequencies. And then when that high note would play, everything would explode again, a little bit less than before, but still explode. So in fact, I feel like I addressed only half the problem. However, that low note was the biggest problem, so I still uploaded it as it is, and I just made a mental note in the future to pay more attention to dominant resonances in the bass. So do this test a little bit for yourself. Figure out in your track, what are the most prominent frequencies in your low end? It might be the kick, it might be your sub bass. I don't know what elements are in there for you. And then play that mix in the car. See what happens when those frequencies play. Does the energy in the car kind of resonate and vibrate, and does everything kind of explode and your whole mix becomes blurry? Then you know you're probably dealing with either just too much bass energy overall, in which case you can either just reduce it or multiband compress it, something like that. Or it might be a dominant resonance, so one frequency needs to be notched down for the entire bass to feel more coherent. Once you've gone through this process once or twice, your ears will become more attuned to this, and in your future project you'll be able to identify these problems faster when they appear. There's nothing more discouraging in music, I find, than to think something sounds great in your studio, bring it out into the world, and it doesn't translate well to other systems. So this is one of the keys and one of the most important ways to upgrade your ears, to identify why things might sound weird in other systems. Go follow my Foundations course or my Foundations Level 2 course if the technical side of making music is a struggle for you. Come join us on our Discord channel to discuss what you're doing with this. And until next time, stay producing, be good to each other, and take care. Bye-bye.